So it's this place of unhooking from courage is only like the big flashy do type stuff or the activism that's all important. But it's also about what is the courage that you have within. And in particular, I see living a courageous life as being about letting who you truly are on the inside be how you actually live on the outside so that you're not pretending, you're not holding yourself back, but you're really living a deeply courageous life because that's going to make you happier and it's going to make the people around you happier. It's going to ultimately have a ripple effect.
I'm Casey Main, a jaded, hopelessly romantic, health-conscious party girl searching for meaning. And my mission is simple, to make life better, for myself and for you. I believe real change always comes from within, and the Better You podcast was born to discover hidden parts of ourselves and our stories. A safe place where we have real, honest conversations with people from all walks of life to help better understand ourselves so we can become better versions of ourselves. So come along on this journey of discovery with me so you can become a better you. Welcome back to another episode of the Better You podcast. I am your host, Casey Main. Thank you so much for being here. If this is your first time listening to the show, then know that this podcast is all about better understanding our relationship with ourselves. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for choosing this podcast. I know there are so many podcast options out there, and I just very much appreciate you all taking the time to spend it with me and this podcast. So this is our second episode of this week. So if you have not listened to Tuesday's episode with Dr. John Chubak yet, then I definitely recommend that you do because these two conversations fit together so nicely. Like this is a great follow-up conversation because in Tuesday's episode with Dr. Chubak, we talked a lot about like our programming, like the programming we have going on in our mind, which is essentially then creating our life. And this conversation with Kate is just the perfect follow-up because she gives so many great tips on how to like notice when that programming is popping up, but then also because it takes a lot of courage to tackle our programming, like a lot of courage. It is easier to just remain in the status quo and not try and change anything in your life, and especially like in your internal states and how you react to things and what kind of your comfort-seeking behaviors are and all of that. So I love these two conversations together. So if you haven't listened to Tuesday's episode, I definitely recommend that you do. And another episode I think that pairs nicely with this week is actually last week's episode with Krista O'Reilly Davy-DeGee because we talk about perfectionism in that. And as you'll hear in this episode, perfectionism is kind of one of those fear-based patterns that a lot of us fall into. And Krista really recognizes that. And then she has a beautiful analogy of how to really accept that aspect of yourself and kind of really be rooted in self-compassion. So that conversation pairs really nicely with this one as well. And then to just let you all know what we have coming up next week. So next week we hear from Dr. Ash Eldefrawi, who is the co-author of the book, The 10 Worlds, The New Psychology of Happiness. And this is a cool one. This is a really cool book. It is a psychology-related book. However, there's a great spiritual component to it as well. And it just talks about how there are all these different ways that we view happiness and our beliefs about what makes us happy and how that can kind of be separated into these 10 different like buckets or worlds. And as he explains it, like you'll probably be able to figure out which one you live in, and then as well as other people in your life. And then it just explains so much. So super interesting conversation. Definitely make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss it. Okay, but let's go ahead and talk about today's guest. So Kate Swoboda is the creator of YourCourageousLife.com. director of the Courageous Living Coach certification, and author of The Courage Habit: How to Accept Your Fears, Release the Past, and Live Your Courageous Life. She helps individuals, teams, and companies see where old, fear-based habits have kept people stuck or started to limit what's possible for an organization, and then start creating more courageous lives by getting into the Courage Habit, a 4-part process for behavioral and organizational change. Kate has appeared in Mind Body Green, Entrepreneur, USA Today, Forbes, Lifetime Moms, The Intelligent Optimist, Business Insider, and more. And her website, Your Courageous Life, was named a top 50 blog for happiness by Greatest. She's spoken at conferences and seminars on the topic of courage as it relates to personal development, business and marketing, money mindset, wellness, increasing emotional resilience, and healthy goal setting using habit formation techniques. And in this episode, we discuss how courage can look differently for all of us and that it doesn't always live in big, flashy actions. Our tendency to see our patterns as part of our identity versus learned behavior. The cue, routine, reward loop and how it can build fear-based habits. Which part of the loop we need to change in order to change our habits. How to use discernment to identify which habit loops are out of integrity with who we are. The 4 main fear routines: perfectionism, people-pleasing, pessimism, and self-sabotage. Different ways we can access the body and be present to help us disrupt a routine. What it means to listen without attachment. The importance of recognizing and releasing our emotions so we can get to clear thinking. How involving other people in our life is more courageous than doing it on our own. And finally, the importance of realizing discomfort won't kill you. This is such a great conversation. Thank you so much again to Kate for coming on. I love her outlook and the way she's organized it all, because for those of you who are very practical and action oriented, like these are some like legit tips of how to recognize some of the programming that we have on autopilot that isn't serving us. So that's it. Let's go ahead and jump into this conversation with Kate. Well, I want to start with just kind of why this book and why this topic? Like why is courage your thing?
Well, courage, I mean, I I'm biased, granted, but I think courage should be everybody's thing. We live in a world where we really need people to be more courageous, and the usual interpretation of that statement is about being more courageous to take political action and things of that nature. And I'm 100% on board with that. And I also think that the change that our world really needs, it starts within each of us. So it's about, how am I showing up with courage in my own life? How am I showing up with courage in how I talk to myself within? How am I showing up with courage in my marriage or partnerships, as a parent, in my career? So it's this place of unhooking from courage is only like the big flashy do type stuff, or the activism that's all important. But it's also about, what is the courage that you have within. And in particular, I see living a courageous life as being about letting who you truly are on the inside be how you actually live on the outside, so that you're not pretending, you're not holding yourself back, you're not telling yourself you can't go after the things that you want to go after, or you got to be realistic, but you're really living a deeply courageous life, because that's going to make you happier, and it's going to make the people around you happier. It's going to ultimately have a ripple effect, I think. So I see courage as being certainly self-serving in some ways when we undertake the idea, but there's a larger application. And so when writing The Courage Habit, I was often thinking about that. I profile a mom in The Courage Habit who is just feeling totally overwhelmed around parenting. And it's like, you think about just that one family unit and how practicing more courage for that one person means that her marriage is better. It means that her kids are better. And it's like there are a million examples of how it's not just about one person being courageous. It's about the betterment of all when one person makes that decision.
I love that so much because you're right. A lot of times the word courage gets lumped into these huge actions or huge changes that we maybe want to make in our life, or go after dreams or whatever. And yes, it is that, but really before it ever reaches that point, it has to be courage in all the little moments of life. So, to the courage to address your own feelings and emotions, the courage to, bring up the maybe uncomfortable conversation with your partner because you need to have it to feel better, versus just kind of brush it away and saying it's no big deal. Like all of those little things we go through in life, where sometimes it's easier to go the easy route, the non-confrontational, the comfortable route, and it's very difficult to have the courage to show up in those little moments and those little decisions. So I think that's a really great foundation for this conversation of when we're talking about courage. It's not necessarily that you've got to go do something drastic. It's just, like you said, the courage to be your true self and show up as that in your life every day.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are just a million applications to it. And in particular, though, really thinking about how do we make courage something that is habitual so that it can become part of who we are. And I say that because, often another thing we think of when we think of as courage is like, like you grit your teeth and like you get your fists together. And you're like, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna do this big courageous thing. And I personally, I find that kind of courage, certainly, yeah, if I was going to take up skydiving, that would be a moment I'd have. But the courage that I think we most need is really about that living of a life that is full of meaning, that is interconnected, that relies to some degree on timeless virtues, of which courage is just one. And when we do that often enough, we can actually make courage into a habit. And so that was another thing that I thought was pretty important, because if somebody's just constantly like gritting their teeth and going, okay, I'm going to be courageous, it's like that gets exhausting after a while. And I think
Mhm.
we often forget that nobody's born courageous, and people accept that pretty easily. They're like, yeah, I got it. Like people just aren't, but nobody's born fearful either. These fear-based habits that we've taken on because we've done them for so long become things that are conditioned into us, and then people start even talking about them as identities. People will go, oh, I'm such a people pleaser, I know, I got to stop that. Or, oh, I
Mhm.
get into perfectionism. It's like, you didn't come out into the world a perfectionist. You learned that fear-based behavior. You've practiced it so many times that it's become an identity. What if you can interrupt that pattern? And instead of that being your identity, it being, okay, so yeah, the perfectionism thing, it trips me up still because I've done it for a really long time. But now I'm actually into, okay, what is the truth of what needs to happen for me in this moment? Let me pause, let me reflect. And that is an example of what it can look like to live a more courageous life, getting unhooked from reacting and interested in what it looks like to just respond, which is a slower and more presence-based process.
Okay, yes, because you talk in the book about fear-based habits versus courage-based habits, which I don't know, there's something about that word habit that kind of caught me off guard, because I think in terms of, oh, fear-based thoughts or feelings or, courageous thoughts, but I had never thought of it in terms of habits. And so as with any habit, it takes a while to break a bad one and instill a good one. So like talk a little bit more about how both of these things, these fear or courage, can live in habit
Okay.
form.
Well, so if you look at behavioral science research into habit formation, habits are formed on a cue, routine, reward loop. And so the things that you learn, the things that you do when they become habits, it's because there's a cue. And then you go into a routine, and that routine is always designed to get you to a reward. And sometimes people might say, well, what do you mean it's designed to get to a reward? Because when I feel the cue of fear, like I feel like I'm afraid of what's going on, like COVID and the world and everything else, and I go into a routine of perfectionism, which is a fear-based routine, how is it a reward that I went into perfectionism? Because the perfectionism thing doesn't work out so very well for me. Well, my answer is in the short term, you get the reward. And habits you keep defaulting to, it's because you're after that short-term reward. And it's at you're sacrificing when you change a habit, you're sacrificing the short-term reward for the long-term gain. So what's the reward in the short term for that perfectionism, which is a fear-based habit? Control. When I don't feel like I have control in my life or in the world, and I go into overwork mode, which is something I still sometimes catch myself doing, it's because I'm trying to get control over something. So that perfectionism actually has a reward in the short term. Long term, of course, it's burnout and disconnection and feeling disgruntled with the work and feeling out of sorts and all that good stuff. So not so very fun. So the work then, when you change a habit, you certainly can play around with switching out the cues. You certainly can play around with trying to give yourself rewards that will motivate you to change. And I'll use a food example because this is just so common. You know, when people are trying to change up and not have so much sugar, maybe they will, try to remove the cue of sugar from their homes by not having sugar in the home. Or maybe they'll try to reward themselves by going, if I go X days without sugar, then I'm going to treat myself to, I don't know, a new pair of shoes or a little extra, Netflix time to just hang out and chillax. But in fact, what we find, if you look at the behavioral research into this, is that the routine is the place you need to change. And it makes sense to me, at least, because with trying to get the cues out of the picture, you are never going to bubble wrap your life. You are never going to set up your life so that you never, if we just use the food example, so that you never encounter sugar. It's everywhere. It's all over the place. So there's a certain amount of willpower that's required for removing cues or trying to hold out for like a really great reward to motivate yourself to change. The routine in the middle is actually the thing. So my whole deal is, okay, let's go back to this perfectionism example. You feel the cue of fear and the world feels uncertain and chaotic and you got a lot of stuff and you really want to make a dream happen. Maybe you go into the routine of perfectionism. That's what's going to happen. What you need to do, though, to stop is interrupt the routine. And once you interrupt the routine, that's when you're empowered to change. And when I was writing The Courage Habit, the 4 parts of the Courage Habit process, which you can use one of them, you could use all of them. It's more effective if you do, were to access the body, listen without attachment, reframe limiting stories, reach out and create community. So it's, I feel the cue of fear. I go into perfectionism. Oh, let me interrupt that pattern. Reach out and create community. Call my girlfriend. Listen to Casey Main's podcast where people are talking about things that get me out of that limiting thinking and into what else is possible for living a better life. Let me slow down, access the body, breathe. Let me listen to what the fear is telling me about getting all that stuff done and recognize, hey, that's a lie. I know it's a lie. I always realize it in hindsight. Let me realize it in the here and now. So you're not going to use any of the tools that I'm talking about today where it's like flipping a switch and, oh, yay, now I do my life perfect. It's actually very human and very humane to just go, oh, yeah, I'm totally going to run a fear-based pattern again. But the good news is now I can actually go, wait a second. I want to shift that pattern so that it can become a new habit. And at first, you will be what Angela Duckworth in the book Grit calls being consciously incompetent, which is when you are so painfully aware of how bad you are at something. And after time, with enough practice, you become unconsciously competent, meaning without even thinking about it, you're good at something. Most people are unconsciously competent at their fear pattern. They go into it without even thinking about it, and they're very, very good at running those fear patterns. And there will be a discomforting part of the process where you are consciously incompetent, like, oh my gosh, I'm bad at this. I'm doing it again. Man, I'm doing it again. But this is how we change. And I got to tell you from my own experience and then from working with clients, I'm pleased to report that yes, the work is worth it. You will get there. There does come a place where it's like, okay, I'm doing this thing again. Let me slow down a little bit and actually use my tools.
Okay. All right. I love this because it is very like action item process, like practical, like here's what you do. And I think I conceptually understand it, especially in the kind of fear, perfectionism in the pandemic world. But going back to the food example, so say somebody is trying to remove the cues or whatever because they don't want to eat too much sugar, or so then they decide on their reward of shoes or whatever. What is the routine there that's in the middle that that person should actually be
Hmm.
tackling?
So, okay. Um, I mean, we can go like super reductive just with the sugar, which is the cue of wanting sugar, the routine of having it, and the reward of the temporary gratification of having had sugar, or the cue of wanting it and the routine of denying oneself and then holding out for the reward, really, which again is going to feel probably very, very willpower dependent. And depending on the time of
Hmm.
day and how much food you've had and how much stress you're feeling, you will be more and less successful at that to varying degrees. I'm thinking of it like, I mean, I'll just say for myself, like if I'm, sugar is a great example. It's one of those things where I can have a really strong craving for it, and if I indulge that craving to any degree that is over and above, maybe like, two of those little Reese's mini cup things, I actually don't feel good and I don't like how I feel. But in the moment, it's really hard to recognize that. So,
Hmm.
there's this cue that's the craving, but how can we use courage habit tools even there? Well, how about accessing the body? It's like, why am I wanting sugar right now? I almost feel like with COVID happening, alcohol is the better example. You know, I-
I was just thinking alcohol in just my own life, and I've had this love-hate relationship with alcohol. Okay, so yeah, continue with alcohol as an example. That's a
yeah,
good one.
yeah. So, it's like, okay, what's the cue for most people with alcohol? Well, at first, it's, oh my God, I'm too overwhelmed. I need something to actually like chemically depress my system a little bit because it feels like too much. And I get it. And that's fine. And um, I think that once in a while, sometimes chemical interventions are just not the worst thing in the world. What's problematic is when it gets to be, it's 5 o'clock. So I open a bottle of wine by default. And then you're having wine every single day. And then it is something that, because the fact of biochemistry with wine is that the more often you're drinking it, the more your tolerance will go up. So that one glass of wine, which, people debate, is it healthy, is it not, da da da. Fine, probably one glass of wine isn't going to hurt you. But when it starts to become three a night or more, or more, or more as your tolerance raises, that's where it's problematic. So with COVID, I have absolutely had nights, days where I'm feeling the stress and it's like, okay, oh my God, glass of wine would be really great right now. But hold on a second, let me access the body. Let me slow down a little bit. And accessing the body doesn't have to just be meditation. I mean, I'm a CrossFit addict here. Speaking of addiction, yeah, swap out the addictions that don't do you as much good in the long term for the ones that do. And CrossFit, I would argue, does. So it's like, okay, I don't feel like going and doing the burpees right now and swinging a kettlebell and all that, CrossFit-y stuff. I don't feel like that because what I'd love to reach for is the thing that's easy and immediate. All you have to do is twist a cap or pop a cork and you're good. Well, yeah, but if I slow down and access the body, then it's like, okay, what am I really wanting here? Because what I'm really wanting here is alleviation of the stress. Let me do the thing that actually doesn't involve alcohol. Or if I have the glass of wine, let me monitor the impulse to then do it the next night and then the next night and then the next night. Same thing with, there are other interventions I could use. I could notice that, oh, well, the reason I want the wine is because I'm stressed. That's the cue. Let me go into the routine of calling my BFF and just kind of checking in with her and getting some connection. let me go listen to the podcast. Let me go read the book that reminds me of what I'm really about. Let me go do something that's connecting. Or I could listen to the fear. Why am I, it's like, man, the news headlines and the fear and the uncertainty we're all feeling, like I said, I don't blame anybody who's like, oh my God, give me a bottle of wine. But listening to what the fear is saying, listening without attachment. Fact, we don't know what the future will hold. We just don't know. I mean, we could have a vaccine in the next, 2 weeks. It doesn't seem like it's likely, but you never know what is going to happen. Things happen all the time that change our perspective. So listening without attachment, okay, the fear is telling me this, I don't actually know. I'm not going to go future tripping when I don't actually know. Reframing limiting
Mm-hmm.
stories. What am I going to do about X, Y, and Z? Well, I'll get there when I get there. Or why don't I just jot down 3 proactive things I could do right now? So there are a whole host of things you can do other than just reach for the wine bottle. And I get why the impulse is there to do that. My encouragement would be to monitor that, because over and over and over, it's like how many movies, books, stories, blogs, and other people need to testify to the point that turning to substances to manage stress isn't helpful before it's going to be like, oh yeah, so turning to substances to manage stress is not helpful.
Well, so yes, but here's where I then get tripped up, because I know myself, and I can tend to be this like all or nothing person, which has been a lot of my history and back and forth with alcohols, trying to find that kind of healthy medium. So let's stick with that example, because I get tripped up with, okay, at what point is something a bad idea? Because I'm not anti myself or anyone having a glass of wine, heck, having two, heck, deciding like, actually, I just want to get really drunk tonight. Like, I don't ever think it's the actual thing that is necessarily right or wrong, but more like the intention behind it, which sounds familiar to what you're saying. It's because that the reason you're really doing it is if it's based in fear, then that's maybe what we want to pay attention to. So is is that ultimately like the big question of which one of these cue, routine, reward loops we should dig into in our lives, is like identifying which ones are rooted in fear, and then how do we do that?
Well, what I hear in what you share, I hear a couple things. Like, one, I hear I'm an all or nothing person, which is like, okay, you could question or reframe that limiting story. It's like, you weren't born an all or
Oh
nothing
man, yeah,
person,
look at
right?
me.
Like
Yeah.
there's that possibility too. So there's that piece.
Okay, oh, this is good. I'm good with using me as an example. Yep. All right. So I just totally shared a
Yeah,
limiting
and
story.
I
Okay, keep
have
going.
I have plenty of them too. So I'm raising my hand here, and I've been that way as well. Um, is what I hear in what you pose is a question of discernment. And um,
Hmm.
my thing about discernment, I actually have a blog post about this where I say the unfortunate thing about discernment is that the only way to really learn discernment is by effing up discernment. Like like, what is the difference between that's a really fun one night stand and, oh my God, I like completely disrespected my body having sex with that stranger? Well,
Hmm.
honestly, I don't know anybody who, does that for the first time, who really knows before they go into it. It's not like there's a flow chart, right? There's not a
Right.
matrix, flow chart matrix decider thing. Yes, proceed to bubble 2, right? So here's what I would answer. How do you know if it's the right thing or not? If you don't feel in integrity with yourself when you look yourself in the mirror. That's it.
Ah.
So, like I can sit here now and I can say, yeah, I've had nights where I was stressed since COVID hit and I had a glass of wine, but I don't feel any charge about that because I know that I did that. Um, I know that it's not nightly. I know that it's not even weekly. I know that it's not a lot. I know that we're talking about, like, I know what my limit is. It just, I don't know, it just doesn't feel like a charge for me. But if I could not look myself in the mirror, then I know something's up. frankly, if it was a charge for me, I don't think I'd even bring it up on a podcast. And I did actually, in full disclosure, so my daughter was born in 2014, and in 2015, my husband and I bought our first home together, and we bought a bottle of wine that night that we closed on the house to celebrate. And that was pretty fun. So we did the next night. And then that was pretty fun. So we did the next night. And then that was pretty fun. So we did the next night. And I mean, literally, we were drinking every night for all of 2015 and getting into 2016. And it was absolutely becoming a problem for me. I don't think I was an alcoholic or am an alcoholic, but I absolutely see how it could have gone that route, because it was just like, if I had even the slightest stressful day, I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking, when's it 5 o'clock? And then it was like 4:30, and then it's like, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. And then it was, 4 o'clock. It's like, and then on the weekends with no childcare, I was like, it's 3 o'clock. What the hell? And it was just more and more and more all the time. So in 2017, and I was noticing, by the way, too, like biochemical cues. Like if I saw an episode of Scandal and Olivia Pope was opening up, I forget what the name is of that wine that she really, really liked. But if she was opening up a bottle of wine and the glug, glug, glug was happening when she poured it, like I was feeling like, ooh, I want a glass of wine, So I was noticing those things. And I was, by the way, writing The Courage Habit at the time. So I was reading a lot of the literature on habit formation and stuff like that. And I in 2017, I just went, okay, like I have to stop this. And so I did not have a single drink for 6 months. And I'd say it took 3 months before I no longer thought about having a drink when I was having a stressful day. And with time, it's just become not a thing. But I don't know. I don't see myself as being above it. And so I think the consciousness and the presence is really important. And I don't see myself as someone who's above it. What I mean is like these patterns can come out in anyone, depending on the right context.
Mm-hmm.
So do you feel in integrity when you look yourself in the mirror? And that would be a great test for anybody who's listening to this podcast today. Do you go look in the mirror? Did you confront that person and let them know, no, I got a boundary here. I'm saying no. Did you do it in a way where when you look in the mirror, you feel in integrity with you? Or did you do it in a way where you look in the mirror, you feel, I think I actually put that person down. I didn't do a boundary. I actually put them down, and now we're in conflict and that doesn't feel good. And again, it's discernment, because there are going to be people pleasers who listen to this who are going to be like, I feel so guilty with anything, any boundary. I get it, and it's discernment to figure out when it's high achieving versus perfectionism. It's all discernment. And I think, do you feel in integrity with you is a good starting question. And you got to keep practicing with these tools to really get clear on what your personal true north is.
I love that. I love the kind of looking at yourself in the mirror and asking yourself that question, because, it's those moments alone with yourself, which we rarely take these days because we live such just crazy, busy, distracted in a million ways lives. And luckily, the one good of all of this is hopefully it's caused a little bit of a slowdown for people. But, because the stories we tell others are one thing, but it's like the stories we tell ourselves are another thing. So can you be honest with yourself and even answering that question? And so it's kind of like this, you've got to have a certain level of self-awareness to even know where to begin with all of this, to see where your courage habits are, where your fear habits are. Like you have to know your true north to start.
Well, I think the true north emerges with time, but the tools of the courage habit help that to emerge. So it's like accessing the body. There are times as a parent, and any parent is going to relate to this one, where, something's coming up with your kid and you don't quite know how the best way to handle it. And you got to pick something, because that's your kid. And I think that slowing down and accessing the body is like part of how I figure it out in those moments. And yes, with time, again, with discernment, we learn in hindsight, unfortunately. you look back and you go, oh, here's how I'd like to do that differently next time. But the best shot that I think most of us really have in the moment, because we're always going to be encountering new things, is going to be, how do I just not automatically go into the fear pattern on autopilot? And slowing down, the more somebody can do that, the better. And I mean, I'm a huge fan of a daily meditation practice. I think, it doesn't have to be like super strict Zen Buddhist meditation, with a mudra and looking at a wall, watching your breath. I do guided meditation every day. I'm a meditation teacher for Simple Habit. I love guided meditation. But it's a process that will happen, and the self-awareness is always unfolding. I don't think you have to be self-aware before you can do this. I definitely think, though, that it is the, wonderful side benefit of all this. You start to actually get to know who you are and what you really want your life to be about.
Oh, I love that. Okay, I want to get into the 4 steps, but first, I want you to explain the 4 common fear routines. You've mentioned and alluded to the perfectionism a couple times, but go through the 4 of them, because I thought that was really interesting.
Okay. So these are 4 fear patterns that people have. They're the routines in the cue, routine, reward cycle. Everybody does all of them. So it's not about, oh, I don't do that one. The one you think you don't do is probably I think the one you probably do the most. But usually there's one that hooks you more than the rest of them. So the 4 fear patterns are perfectionism, people pleasing, or martyrdom, but I prefer the term people pleasing, pessimism, and self-sabotage. And perfectionism, pretty self-explanatory. It's wanting to do things perfectly, / being beyond judgment. People pleasing is a habit of putting other people's needs ahead of your own, and this could be putting the all sacrificing mother, your job, your work, your partner's needs, putting those things ahead of your own needs. Pessimism is probably the one that's hardest for people to claim, but I think it's pretty important to claim. And pessimism is, well, I just got to be realistic. Well, come on. Like, if I could just, sure, that dream would happen if I could just like sit on a yacht all day with money, but that's not going to happen for me. So it's this kind of like cutting off options from the get-go. And the interesting thing about COVID is how much pessimism is coming out. Most people don't like to own up to the pessimism because our culture has some pretty strong conditioning around wallowing, and pessimism is associated with wallowing. But actually, it's very common for everybody, and people just don't like to own it. So there's pessimism.
I love that, though, the cutting out options, because I do see that a lot, and I do it too. And it's like we think it's logical. Well, no, I can't do this because of this, or you only get jobs if somebody, so there's no point to apply online. Like, it's just, we reason away all these options.
Yes. And I always like to be very intentional about saying that when we're talking about pessimism, we're not talking about bypassing very real oppression. Like, I would never say to someone who's saying, well, I don't believe I got that job because of the color of my skin or because of my gender or something like that. I'm not going to be like, well, I mean, that's a pessimistic attitude. Don't be such a victim. It's like, no. It's that the oppression is very real. Sexism and racism are very real. What would probably qualify more as pessimism would be that it is impossible to get any job anywhere because of, say, your gender. So, or that there's no workplace in the world that will take you seriously if you're a woman. So it's more along those lines. And too, I think pessimism, I would imagine it's easier when we're not hooked in it to see this, but the patterns are hard. I mean, you really think about someone who's feeling deeply pessimistic, they're hurting, they're suffering, they've been knocked down a couple of times. So I really, I don't like going into the whole like quit wallowing, thing, because it just seems so profoundly unkind. Someone's suffering here. So let's be real about that. And then the 4th pattern is self-sabotage. And perfectionism, people-pleasing, pessimism, they're all forms of self-sabotage, and I can see that. But I thought self-sabotage needed to be its own category because that is shiny object syndrome. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Having these wild dreams and plans, but not putting a foundation under them. And then when they don't work out, going, see, of course it didn't work out. It's like, well, you can't spend just because you saved. You can't work out once and then be like, I'm ready for the Olympics. That's not very, it's not grounded in what is likely to produce success. So perfectionism, people pleasing, pessimism, self-sabotage. Again, cue, routine, reward. There's a cue of fear. We go into one of these 4 routines to get a short-term reward, like feeling in control, people not being mad at me. If I'm pessimistic and I don't even try, then I never feel the intimidation or pressure of having gone after something that matters to me. If I sabotage it, then again, I don't have to deal with the fear that I might feel about success, actually. And those are all short term, but what we want are the longer term gains.
Okay, so then if we recognize we're in one of those patterns, step 1 is accessing the body in the moment. So, which I'm sure is easier to do if we have something like a meditation practice. I totally agree with you on that. But if you don't, like, what are ways we can try and access the body in the moment?
Taking a walk, screaming into a towel, punching a pillow, shaking, like just standing up and just like shaking, 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 dancing, smiling, power pose, yoga. So those are all things you can do. Sex or self-pleasure. Hey, if it's aimed at accessing the body and getting present, that counts too. Long, slow shower, soak in the tub, sitting on your porch, watching the clouds pass, noticing your kids and their cheeks. I mean, that might sound really weird, but I'm trying to come up. These are all examples. These are things I do with my life all the time. Sometimes I'm like, as a parent, COVID, home with my kid for 6 weeks now. And, it's like the eternal disclaimer of every parent everywhere. Of course, I love my child. I'd do anything for them. And there's nobody that I actually really like. My family are if I have to, I'll be in quarantine with you 24/7 for all these weeks. But that's actually not how I want to live my best life on a regular basis. So it's very like sometimes she'll be telling me one of those long, meandering 5-year-old stories that makes no sense. And I feel burnt and like I don't have a lot to give as a parent. And what I try to do in those moments is literally just bring my attention to like her eyes and how they shine when she tells me a story, or these cute little cheeks that she's got, and how she, says stample instead of staple, and she says kintyre instead of entire. And it's like, if I'm trying to be in a space of I'm going to hear your story and really like fully be present with you, like I don't have it in me. But what I do have in me is just to access the body, be present with this person. And I feel like maybe I'm not explaining it very well, but it's like this dropping down into getting present so that I don't go into feeling either guilty people pleasing, like, oh my God, I have to be like completely there for her, or like perfectionism of like, I have these other things I need to do right now. I have these tasks. And then, she's not getting any time. So these are like the like moment to moment to moment to moment to moment. It's not like I'm walking into the kitchen when she has one of those long stories with a plan. It's more like moment to moment to moment. And it has absolutely taken practice.
I love that, because it's like it's creating space. It's like it's giving yourself even a chance to not just stay in your normal pattern, but it's like a nice little pause. Coming into the body always brings us into the moment, which then you have more like a shot at an intentional choice of how you react next versus being like just completely reactionary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just don't know how it gets any better than that. And I actually think it's pretty good. I mean, I can go from feeling pretty tapped out as a parent after a long day to feeling deeply appreciative of being a parent. And, I mean, I wouldn't want anyone to quiz me on the substance of the story or what happened first, second, or third in those moments, right?
Yeah.
So this is a technique that might work with 5-year-olds better than it works with 10-year-olds or teenagers, right? Because 10-year-olds and teenagers have different expectations in a conversation. But it's what I've got in the here and now. So accessing the body every moment that you can. Can you take a walk? Can you notice the quality of light on the window? Can you feel your own two hands? Can you what's it going to take? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I love that. All right. So then step 2 is listening without attachment. What does that
Well,
mean?
listening without attachment is hearing the words, but not attaching to them as truth. And the example I like to give is that if a highly intoxicated person came up to you on the street and started going, "You have rainbow hair, you have rainbow hair," you'd hear those words. But unless you have rainbow hair, it's not like you're running to the nearest mirror going, "Oh my God, what's that?" Like you hear the words, but you're not attached to them as truth. And I think,
Mm,
COVID is a great example. And it's something I practice regularly, which is just because I hear on the news about people who have COVID does not automatically mean I will get it. Now, I don't mean that as like
mhm.
a law of attraction affirmation. I literally just mean in the here and now, with the information that I have now, if I go into attaching to COVID contagion as a truth, I'm going to be stressed. I'm going to be anxious. I'm going to be worried. I'm going to be, and like, I'm not saying there isn't cause for concern. Of course there is. I'm sheltering in place. There's cause for concern. If I didn't think there was, I'd be out, doing whatever instead of here, chatting with you and all that stuff, right? I believe in it. But it doesn't do me any good to sit around being stressed about the possibility of contagion. You just do the best you can. So I listen, I hear the news, I limit to some degree how much of it I'm hearing because I don't want to get completely pulled into the psychological undertow of all that. But just because I'm hearing it doesn't mean it's truth. And so, we can do listening without attachment around a lot of different fears. If I don't get this job, it's just going to be a disaster. Well, you don't know that that's true. Actually, something else might happen, or I need my partner to change. Well, you might really be afraid that your relationship won't survive unless your partner changes, but actually, relationships involve two people. What if you profoundly change? It's something I play with, in fact, in my daily life at this point, where it's like, we're moving shortly, as we were kind of chatting about before the recording started. But I have these neighbors at our current house who have a teenage son who, I mean, in my current state of mind, I'm like, this kid's obnoxious. I mean, he just blasts music. He's sitting out back with his friends, drinking and getting high every time they're not around. They throw liquor bottles into our backyard. You ask him kindly, can you cut the shenanigans? And yeah, da da da. Well, here's the thing. Listen without attachment. I've had fears over the years here that if he kept being so loud, I wouldn't get sleep. And if I couldn't get sleep, then I wouldn't be able to do what I needed to do the next day. And like getting stressed about it. And it's like, but I've always gotten to sleep, like let's just slow down a minute. I've always gotten to sleep and it's fine. And then the other thing I like to play with is, what if this is an opportunity to be one of those people who just doesn't care? Because I know
Mm.
y'all exist out there. I don't know how you do it, but I'm very curious to learn. Like, why have this fixed idea that and I'm getting a little bit into reframing limiting stories because with this, because I think the two of them really go together in so many ways. But it's like, why?
Okay, that's fine. It's a good
Yeah, it's
segue.
like,
It's step 3.
reframing limiting stories. Like, I have this idea that I'm a person who cares about these things and thus must respond because they bother me. And it's like, well, what if I figured out how to be one of those people who just doesn't even really notice what their neighbors are doing? So
Mhm.
there's always that possibility. Or what if this is an opportunity to get better at conflict management? What if this is an opportunity to have compassion for this kid? Because again, speaking to, it seems like chemical substances are coming up a lot on this interview. But again, I mean, when a kid's a teenager and they're already using chemical substances as often as I've seen this neighbor do this, something's going on there. Something's not feeling good in that kid's life. So, there are a lot of different ways that I can kind of play with this. And I try, I've been doing it for a long time, trying to do it with really ordinary situations like that. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it is the work of that is paying off during things like COVID, because I'm just not, when the dire predictions about the economy come down, well, I've lived through a recession before. I don't know what's going to happen. Or, it's an opportunity to look at any financial leaks. It's an opportunity to shift my money mindset. I try to remind myself of things like, hey, what do I have control over? Because I certainly don't have control over the economy, but I do have control over where I place my intentions, where I place my attention, and whether I react or respond. And I'd like to be in a place of responding.
Yeah, I love it, especially the listening without attachment, because we do, and especially like listening to what we receive from external sources, but then also listening to what we're telling ourselves. And there's this writer that I love, and I heard him in a podcast once, and he had this quote that had just really stuck with me. And I think about it often. He said, the what ifs point in both
Mm-hmm.
directions, but our brains have a negativity bias. So we always think and start to move in the negative direction of, oh, well, if this happens, then this is going to happen, then this, and we go down this whole futuristic, like negative spiral. But to your point, like we don't know that's what's going to happen. Like it's a guess. And so then we're getting all worked up over a guess of what the future holds when we could be completely wrong. So it's like wasted negative
Yeah.
energy.
I mean, it doesn't, I just look at it like it doesn't feel good. And, there's this, to me, it's about a way of being. I mean, I'm just unapologetically devoted to living a life where I can look myself in the mirror and feel like I'm in integrity, and where who I am and my most courageous self can come to the forefront. And it just seems like getting getting bogged down in the things that I can't control really sucks life out of me. It's not living 100% fully alive. It's also like the humanity of people get mad, people get sad, access the body, let it go. That's the reality of what you're dealing with. Face it, feel it, let it
Yes.
go. So,
I love that because and this has come up in a couple other podcast episodes, that like our emotions, I mean, they're real, but they're not logical, and they can't always be trusted, but we can't just shove them down and not deal with them. So, a lot of this work is very, except for the come into the body part, is very like thinking, okay, let me think about, what am I attaching to this thought? And so that I'm listening without attachment, and what are my limiting stories, and question those. Like that's all very like cerebral. But the coming into the body and say yelling or crying, like you said, that allows us to clear those emotions out, because we can't necessarily think through them because they're not always logical, but they deserve their moment in
yeah,
time.
absolutely. I was on book tour for the Courage Habit, and I'm up at the podium at a bookstore, and I do a little reading and kind of talk about it. And there was a Q&A, and basically this guy in the front row raises his hand, and he didn't say it meanly, but he seemed genuinely a little perplexed. He was like, "So you're telling me if I'm having a really stressful day at work, I might need to cry?" And I'm like, yes, to get to clear thinking. Like, and also too, it's like, what's this thing where we've pathologized emotions? It's like, what is wrong with crying? It's good for you. It releases cortisol. There's all this biochemical stuff that happens when you cry. What's wrong with anger? If it gets the anger out so you don't take it out on other people, punch the pillow, hun. If it's what you need to do to not take a drink because that's the only way that you're dealing with stress and you're worried about it becoming a dependency, do it. If you have writer's block and you're completely, just like, I'm just at my limit, I can't think of anything, cry for a minute. I tell you, a lot of good stuff happens when we actually feel our feelings in ways that we are not then taking them out on other people. Because if we don't feel our feelings, they back up on us.
Yes. Oh, no, I know. I have experienced that
Oh,
firsthand.
yeah.
Okay, talk a little bit more about our limiting stories and how we go about reframing them, because that's a concept that comes up a lot in even in other podcast episodes. And it's like I get it, and I get where, and I can sometimes I can catch myself in those moments of, okay, like limiting beliefs and limiting stories, but then I get tripped up with, how do we unravel them, undo them, reframe them? Like how do we work with them?
Well, I think that when you recognize which of the fear patterns hits you the most, that's how you can get a better handle on the stories that might be playing in the background without your conscious awareness. So, a perfectionist is going to have a
Mm,
story of one of many could be, well, I just better do it myself. If I don't do it, it's not going to get done right. You know? So once you know that, oh, perfectionism is my thing, and in the courage habit, I give some pretty in-depth attention to each of these four fear patterns and what they look like, what they sound like, things that you struggle with when you're trying to shift them. So for instance, a perfectionist, when they're trying to shift out of that pattern, will often have trouble telling the difference between perfectionism and having high standards. It's that
mm,
discernment thing again. So a saboteur, or somebody who is just getting into that self-sabotage, they are likely to have a story of like, oh, well, if I just do this, this, and this, it'll all work out. And not really thinking about putting like a solid foundation underneath all that hard work, expecting that immediate gratification or results. A people pleaser is probably going to have a story like, well, I can't take that time for myself. Somebody else needs me, or I had to step in, or else that person was really going to suffer. They didn't have anyone else. And then a pessimist routine is probably going to have stories like, well, even though I do my best, it just doesn't work out for me, or why bother? Nothing will change, or this is it. The world is just messed up. This is just how it is. So when you know your fear pattern, you have something of an insight into the types of things that pattern typically brings with it. And so again, it's the noticing. You've got to know
mm.
that you do these things. And if somebody really is just like tripped up on the idea of the fear pattern and which one and all that, my encouragement would be, if it doesn't feel good, you got to look at it. And that doesn't
Mhm.
mean that every single thing that doesn't feel good is automatically like fear and somebody else's fault and da da da. I mean, like sometimes, again, discernment. Sometimes we don't feel good because we're figuring out like where we're landing, or something is uncomfortable. But when something doesn't feel good, and particularly when it's chronic, pay attention to it. Pay attention to it. Go, okay, not pay attention to it like in a like giving it more fuel, but pay attention to it as in, what's going on here? Because actually it's tied to sovereignty on some level. I mean, I'm just, like I said, ferociously committed to this idea that like this is my life, that I get to live how I want to live. Why do I want to spend any of it feeling bad? And if I'm feeling
Mhm.
bad, I want to look at why that is and do whatever I can to shift it. And it might be that I change my external circumstances, like moving away from the neighbor. And it might mean that I shift my internal circumstances, which is shifting that this teenage kid just doesn't bother me anymore somehow. And I
Mhm.
don't know what the shift will be. And I don't really care actually which one it is. I just care about when something's chronic and it's not feeling good, how do I notice where I place my intentions, my attention, and how do I respond rather than react?
I love it. I love it. Okay, so step 4 is reach out and create community. So talk a little bit about what all is entailed in that. I mean, it sounds obvious, but I imagine there's more to it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so fear thrives in isolation and it diminishes in community. So, the days I've had the ugly cry, the hardest thing to do is to text the friend. Yeah, I don't want to bother her. She's like da da
Mm,
da. But
yeah.
when I text the friend, I'm actually doing something incredibly courageous, because I'm basically sending a signal to my emotional self and physical self, you're safe and you are not alone in this. And I think that's so important. I also think too that we don't live these lives in isolation. There's something to be said for really understanding that like the ways that fear shows up for me is it's actually not too far removed from how it shows up for you. I mean, this is the first time that we're talking officially, but my guess is that if we hung out, we had coffee for and talked for an hour about like, how does fear show up for you, Casey, and how does fear show up for me? It's like these, fixed beliefs. It's not enough. It's comparisonitis. It's I could have done it better.
Yep.
It's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. So it's really helpful to see that you're not alone in these things. And then the last thing I'd say too, I found this a really cool research study when I was researching the pieces that went into the courage habit. And so it's like anybody who wants to go after a big dream, whatever that dream is, they actually did a study where they divided the dream between two different people who are just kind of like doing their own thing, and then people who, as they were working towards a goal, they enlisted the support of others. And what they found was that the people who enlisted the support of others, to be expected, they were more likely to be successful. And that seems like the thing that's most obvious. The thing that came along with it, though, that I loved the most was that those people had greater satisfaction throughout the entire process. So we're talking about going from I'm happy when I hit the goal versus I'm happy all along the way of the process, even though challenges arise. And then it's really cool when I hit the goal. Oh, and I'm more likely to hit the goal. So involving other people in your life, even when you have a crazy idea, big dream, something that nobody really you think is going to understand, you find your people who do. The one thing I'll add to that, the people who have the pattern of self-sabotage, one piece that goes along with that pattern to be aware of is people who self-sabotage have an almost magnetic attraction to telling the like wet blanket naysayer people about their ideas early on. So that's the one thing that I would say be really conscious of with big dreams and goals.
Oh, wow. So that's like a part of the self-sabotage
Yes.
is let me tell this one person who is going to absolutely tell me every reason why I can't
Why
do
it's
it.
not the right time in the economy. And are you sure? And I don't know. It's this, that is definitely a pattern. So that's the one thing to be aware of. So just you have to pick who your people are. And in the courage habit, I actually talk about courage-based values and how to start recognizing who those people are, because sometimes people aren't aware and it can really catch them off guard. And then they think it's themselves. They think, oh, it's me. I'm, this dream was not realistic or da da da. And you go into the pessimism, but actually it's no, sometimes it's the people you're talking to.
Yeah, I love that reach out and create community though, because I had like a little aha moment of we tend to instead tie courage to and like put on a pedestal this concept of independence, going it alone, which equates to strength. And this is kind of blowing all that up, being like, no, actually it's stronger. It's more courageous to do it together, and you will be stronger and happier along the way and probably get where you want to go if you include others, not this whole independent, go it alone mentality.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I found nothing in any of the psychological literature I've reviewed that said that people who are totally alone, are just happier people. It's like, no, I mean,
Yeah, no,
there's probably a study somewhere that someone's done, but I haven't found it.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, monks who live alone and just meditate all day, you might be able to argue they're happier than we are because they've reached some level of like inner bliss and existential, who knows. But for the majority of us living in life, I think we need each other.
Yeah. Well, and the courage habit is informed, by the way, by Buddhist psychology, which, questioning of beliefs, which is listening without attachment, reframing limiting stories, is absolutely part of that.
Yes, I've written a couple articles on Buddhism for a site Yogi Approved, and the concept of attachment and breaking attachment in all forms of life has been like very fascinating and helpful for me. So I love that listening without attachment concept. Okay, so I want to close out with a question of just like what's something that you wish more people understood about fear in general?
The discomfort won't kill you. Are you willing to be with the discomfort of the thing that you want, the big dream? That's it.
true, but like the process and the pursuit, change in general, even the little change, going back to the beginning of the conversation, the little changes of speaking up and saying what you want to say, or setting the boundaries with friendships, family, whatever it is, those kinds of changes are uncomfortable. So you're right. It's this very simple but very monumental realization that you can survive uncomfort. You will survive uncomfort. And there's likely a lot of happiness and success on the other end of it. You just have to push through it.
Yeah. It's like, go read Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Go read that book and then ask yourself, am I really not going to be able to like withstand the discomfort of putting up some boundaries, or really, training for that triathlon, or talking to my partner about our sex life? You really have to understand that the depths of resilience that humans are capable of is so much more than any of us experience in our day-to-day life. What I would say, getting back to the person listening to this, is you can withstand the discomfort. It will not kill you. I love the soon-to-be author and meditation teacher, Sarah Blondin, and she has this meditation called When We Must Endure. And this line from it the other day I heard, she said, the weather that you can withstand is in direct proportion to how much you'll grow. And I loved that. It's like, oh yeah, that's the story I want to take on, because the story, I can't handle this, doesn't feel very good. The story, what doesn't kill me will make me stronger, that totally works for me.
I love it. Thank you so much for coming on and chatting. Tell everybody where they can find and buy the book, where they can find more information about you and your work.
Well, The Courage Habit is at Amazon, Barnes & Noble. Can't go to Barnes & Noble and all that right now, but Amazon, your local bookseller, buy local, all that good stuff, The Courage Habit. And then you can learn more about me at yourcourageouslife.com. I'm also the director of the Courageous Living Coach certification at teamclcc.com. And probably my favorite social media place to hang out is Instagram, where I'm Kate Courageous.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, that'll do it for this week. I hope you enjoyed this episode as well as Tuesday's episode, and make sure that you are subscribed and you don't miss next week's episode. It is another super interesting conversation. I'm just so excited about the guests that we've had on recently and the guests we've got coming up. Lots of cool stuff. So make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. Make sure you are also following the podcast on the socials. We are on Instagram and Facebook at The Better You Podcast. And you can always reach me with feedback or topic suggestions, guest suggestions. Like, I'd love to know what you guys want to hear about or who you want to hear from. You can email me at thebetteryoupodcast@gmail.com. And I think that's it. Oh yeah, if you enjoyed this, then please leave a rating or review on whatever podcast app you are listening on. That helps a lot and it means a lot to me. It really makes my day when I see